let's not misunderstand what climate action is. If people think that this government's approach to so-called climate action is working, then they should have a really good look at it, because it's actually not bringing emissions down. We brought emissions down. It's moving twice as fast and leading to 4 times as fast as the rest of the world. You have a Labor Party in government that cannot even explain how it will reach net zero by 2050, what it will cost to reach the 2035 targets that it has articulated. Now, our friends in the media didn't really, these are really important questions for the government. How much will it cost to get to 62 to 70% target by 2035? Those questions, if asked, have remained completely unanswered. With respect to the seats that, of course, we will be pitching for and presenting serious, credible, compelling policy alternatives at the next election. They do include the city seats.
In the carefully stage-managed world of climate policy, where governments announce ambitious emission reduction targets with great fanfare and moral certainty, where every new commitment is presented as evidence of leadership and vision, and where questioning the costs or feasibility of these targets is treated as evidence of climate denial rather than basic fiscal responsibility, Opposition leader Susan Ley has done something that should be unremarkable, but has become extraordinary in modern Australian politics. She has asked the most basic questions that any competent government should be able to answer about their signature policy commitment. What will it cost? How will you achieve it? Where is the detailed plan that explains how Australia transitions from current emissions levels to the targets you have set? And she has exposed something that should terrify every Australian who cares about economic security and governmental competence. The Labor government cannot answer these questions. Welcome to Australian Enigma, where we expose the truth about how Labor announces climate targets with the confidence of people who have done the detailed work, whilst leaving the most fundamental questions completely unanswered, and how their approach to so-called climate action is not actually bringing emissions down, despite the enormous costs imposed on Australian families and businesses. Subscribe now for daily analysis that refuses to accept target announcements as policy achievements, when the government cannot even explain how it will reach net zero by 2050, or what it will cost to reach the 2035 targets that they insist are essential to Australia's future.
But I know that people in the city are struggling with affordability of energy costs. I know that people who work in areas that are dependent on energy-intensive industries, whether it be heavy industry, which we no longer seem to have any more of in this country because of the government's policy, whether it be the prospective data centres or AI that all require intensive energy, or whether it be something that is a local small business that is manufacturing from aluminium that is about to close down when Alcoa closes down. These are highly relevant questions to people in the cities. And I talk about mums with kids who are struggling to pay the bills, and I meet them in the cities all the time. I'm just coming along.
Well, I think the reality here is that we've got a policy before us at the moment, the Albanese government policy, that is seeing power prices go up and emissions not coming down. What we're saying is that we want to make sure that we put a policy in place that, first of all, is believable and achievable, that will put downward pressure on energy.
Ley's critique cuts to the heart of what has become the defining characteristic of Labor's climate policy: all announcement, no substance. Targets are set with great ceremony. International commitments are made with solemn declarations about Australia's moral obligations. Press conferences are held where ministers speak about leadership and ambition and the imperative of climate action. But when you ask the most basic questions about implementation and cost, you encounter either silence or evasion or attacks on the questioner for daring to prioritise fiscal responsibility over environmental virtue. The accusation that if people think this government's approach to so-called climate action is working, then they should have a really good look at it because it is actually not bringing emissions down, deserves careful examination, because it reveals the gap between rhetoric and reality that characterises Labor's entire approach. The government speaks constantly about climate action, about emission reduction commitments, about Australia playing its part in global efforts. But speaking about action is not the same as taking effective action. Announcing targets is not the same as achieving them. And claiming to prioritise climate outcomes is meaningless if your policies are not actually delivering emission reductions. This is the fundamental fraud at the centre of Labor's climate policy. They have convinced large portions of the Australian public and media that they are serious about climate action because they talk about it constantly, because they announce ambitious targets, because they attend international conferences and make solemn commitments. But when you examine actual emissions data rather than ministerial press releases, when you look at what is happening in the real economy rather than in policy documents, the picture is very different. Emissions are not falling at the rates required to meet the targets Labor has set. The policies implemented are not delivering the outcomes promised, and the costs being imposed on Australian families and businesses through higher energy prices and subsidies are not translating into meaningful emission reductions. The inability to explain how the government will reach net zero by 2050 is particularly damning because this is not a new target sprung on them unexpectedly. Net zero by 2050 has been the centrepiece of climate policy across multiple governments for years. Labor has had ample time to develop detailed pathways showing how Australia transitions from current emissions levels to zero net emissions by mid-century. They should be able to produce comprehensive modelling showing which sectors must reduce emissions by how much, which technologies will enable those reductions, what infrastructure investments are required, what the economic impacts will be, and what it all cost. The fact that they cannot provide these details despite years to develop them reveals that net zero is a slogan rather than a serious policy with worked-through implementation plans. But if the lack of detail about the 2050 target is damning, the inability to explain what it will cost to reach the 2035 targets is catastrophic. These are not distant, aspirational goals. These are near-term commitments that will require massive economic transformation within the next decade. If Labor cannot tell Australians what achieving these targets will cost, then they are asking the country to embark on an economic experiment with unknown price tags and uncertain outcomes. This is not policy making. This is recklessness dressed up as environmental leadership. Think about what it means that these questions, if asked, have remained completely unanswered. This is not a situation where the government has provided answers that critics dispute, or where different modelling produces different cost estimates that can be debated. This is a situation where the most basic questions about policy costs and implementation pathways have not been answered at all. When journalists ask, they receive vague references to modelling that is not made public, or to ongoing work that never seems to conclude. When opposition members ask in Parliament, they receive non-answers that avoid the substance of the question, whilst attacking the questioner's motives. When business groups ask, they are told that detailed consultation is ongoing, whilst decisions that affect their operations are made without that consultation being meaningfully incorporated. This pattern of non-answers is deliberate rather than accidental. Labor knows that if they provided honest costings for their climate targets, the Australian public would be horrified. The amounts required to transform Australia's energy system, to retrofit buildings, to electrify transport, to develop new industries while shutting down existing ones are staggering. Estimates from various independent sources suggest achieving net zero could cost hundreds of billions of dollars, with some projections reaching into the trillions when you account for all necessary investments and economic disruptions. If Labor admitted these numbers, if they honestly explained what pursuing their targets would require, public support would evaporate immediately. So instead, they maintain strategic ambiguity. They announce targets without costings. They implement policies without honest impact assessments. They impose costs through mechanisms that obscure the true price of their climate agenda. Renewable subsidies are buried in electricity bills rather than appearing as explicit budget items. The costs of unreliable generation are socialized across all consumers rather than attributed to the renewable investments that created the reliability problems. The economic impacts of industrial closures are treated as unfortunate but unrelated to energy policy, rather than direct consequences of making energy unaffordable for energy-intensive industries. This approach allows Labor to claim they are taking climate action seriously whilst avoiding accountability for the costs of that action. They can point to renewable deployment, to emission reduction commitments, to international agreements, whilst denying or obscuring the relationship between these policies and the power bill increases that Australians are experiencing. They can blame energy companies for price rises, whilst ignoring that those rises are driven by the costs of renewable subsidies and network upgrades required to accommodate intermittent generation. They can celebrate new renewable projects, whilst remaining silent about the coal plants being forced to close prematurely and the reliability challenges that creates. The characterization of Labor's approach as so-called climate action rather than genuine climate action is significant, because it questions whether what Labor is doing actually constitutes meaningful climate policy, or whether it is primarily political theatre designed to satisfy environmental advocacy groups and international expectations without delivering real emissions reductions. Consider the evidence for this characterization. Labor has implemented numerous policies supposedly designed to reduce emissions. They have subsidized renewable deployment extensively. They have made international commitments with great fanfare. They have created new agencies and funding mechanisms supposedly dedicated to climate action. Yet emissions are not falling at the rates required to meet their own targets. The gap between announced objectives and actual outcomes continues widening. This suggests that Labor's climate policies are not primarily designed to reduce emissions effectively, but to create the appearance of climate action that satisfies political constituents without necessarily delivering environmental outcomes. Announcing ambitious targets creates positive headlines and international praise.